Hi, this is Uri L'Tzedek's Talking Torah and Tzedek. I'm Judry Subar, and I'm here with Rabbi Dr. Shai Held, who is the president, dean, and chair in Jewish thought at Hadar, an institution of higher Jewish learning headquartered in New York City. Rav Shai, hello.
Hi, thanks for having me, Judd.
Sure, it's great to have you here. What I'd like to do today is to focus on your thought as a theologian, in particular with regard to how your theology and your thinking about issues of divine and so forth define how we relate to other people, or how we do and how we should relate to other people. And in particular, I know that in your thinking, your writing, your speaking, you talk a lot in particular about the emotion of love and the role that that plays in Jewish theology. I'd like to start with the following question. I can imagine why you would want the emotion of love to be a big deal in what Jewish thought teaches about how we should relate to the world and to each other. But beyond what you might want in terms of focusing on a dominant and important emotion, why is love in fact such a necessary emotion in your thinking and in your thinking about Jewish thought?
Right. I mean, that's a big question. So let me try to come at it from a couple of different angles. First of all, I think the Torah places a great deal of weight on the emotion of love. If you think about the mandate to love your neighbor as yourself, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, which Rabbi Akiva calls klal gadol b'Torah, the great principle of the Torah, the context there begins with lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha. You shall not hate your neighbor in your heart. Not you shall not hate your neighbor, meaning just don't act hatefully, but don't hate your neighbor in your heart. So in that context, the Torah is reaching beyond my action into my inner world. And in a similar way, Chazal, our sages, don't just say that we should visit the sick or comfort the mourners. They also say that we should be rachum, merciful, chanun, gracious, etc. And that's about a character trait. What I'm suggesting is that Jewish ethics is obviously focused on outward manifestation, on how we act, but is also really focused on our inner world, our interiority, what we feel as we do things. Now, I want to be clear, right? If you give a Jewish ethicist a choice between someone who feels something positive and does nothing, and someone who feels nothing and does something, any Jewish ethicist is going to choose the person who feels nothing and does something, because the primary focus is on meeting human needs and responding to human suffering. However, if you asked a good Jewish ethicist, given a choice between someone who feels nothing and does something, and someone who does something caringly, the choice will always be someone who does something caringly. Now, there's an example of this that I personally find very helpful that comes from secular ethics, although some Jewish philosophers, David Schatz from Yeshiva University and others, have kind of brought it into the Jewish conversation. And I think it's an example, a case that we can relate to very readily. So imagine that, God forbid, you're lying in a hospital and you've been feeling scared and lonely and anxious, and an old friend comes to see you, and for the first time in weeks, you're laughing, you feel a little hopeful. And when the friend gets up to leave, you say, "Thank you so much. It means so much to me that you came." And the friend says, "Oh, don't thank me. I was obligated." So most people would feel in that moment, wait, you came because you were obligated? I thought you came because you care about me. Or I hoped that you would come because you care about me. And that suggests, I think, that we all intuitively know that the motives that other people have when they help us matter to us. It matters whether someone has compassion for you or pity for you. Compassion means they see you as an equal. Pity means they're condescending to you and looking down on you. So both from a theological perspective, the Torah reaches inward, and from a concrete interpersonal perspective, we perceive and care about how others see us. Interiority matters. Emotions matter. Love, and not just loving action, really matters.
So are you saying that having that inner feeling, that the emotion of love, and focusing on the experience of having compassion is something that's important to go along with action, or does it do something to the quality of the action?
Right. So that's, I mean, that is in some ways the billion-dollar question. I think that at minimum, it's the former, that it goes along with the action, but at maximum, ideally, the emotion helps motivate a deeper commitment to the action. Someone who is compassionate is more likely to do compassionate things in the world than someone who does nothing, than someone who feels nothing. So I think the answer is really both. I mean, one of the things I'll tell you that I struggle with, to be honest, there's a Catholic ethicist whose work I very much admire, a guy named Eddie Vacek, and he talks about how he has come to believe, for theological reasons, that someone who visits the sick because he's trying to imitate God visits in a different way than someone who visits simply because it's a human ethical obligation. I'm tempted by that idea, but I'm not sure that I'm confident that it's true, right? I'm intrigued by the idea, but I'm not yet persuaded by it. But I do think that ideally, what happens is what we would call a virtuous cycle or a virtuous circle, right? I feel compassion, I act. That helps deepen my compassion. That helps deepen my commitment to action, etc. I always say it's an interesting thing about this culture. I'm not sure what it says, that everybody knows what a vicious circle is, but no one ever talks about a virtuous circle. But Jewish ethics ideally has a vision of virtuous circles where, you know, the heart follows the deed, which in turn follows the heart, which in turn follows the deed, etc. That's a famous, of course, an allusion to Sefer HaChinuch, which famously says that if you want to move your heart, committing to acting as if you already feel something will help. And what the Baalei Musar in the 20th century add to that is, yes, but you have to really want it, right? Rav Eliyahu Lopian, for example, insists, you know, it's not like automatic. Like I go to the hospital and all of a sudden I become this incredibly compassionate figure. No, it's that I go to the hospital even when I'm not feeling compassionate and I think to myself, I really want this to open my heart so I can do this more fully.
Yeah.
So I want to, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I would actually anticipate something that I suspect you're going to ask me, which is, okay, but can you really decide to feel those things?
Was one of my questions.
Yeah, so because that's the obvious, right? I mean, I think that's the right question. So here's what I would say about that. And here I believe that I'm sort of right square in the line of medieval Jewish thought, which is rooted on this issue in the philosophy of Aristotle. I don't think you can turn emotions on and off. You can't will to feel compassion the same way you can will to open your refrigerator. It's a different thing. But what you can do, and I think Rambam insists we are obligated to do, is cultivate emotion, right? I can work on trying to become the person who feels certain things. That's not the same thing as having this crude notion of I'm walking down the street, I see Judd, and I decide to feel compassion for you. It's more, I can work on becoming the kind of person who, when I see Judd or someone else in a trying circumstance, I am moved by their plight. So cultivation is everything rather than kind of crude in the moment decision making. And that's, I think, important in ethics in general. This is something that the philosopher Iris Murdoch talks about a lot, that, you know, ethics is not primarily about moments of big decision. Ethics is in some ways all about the moments in between the big decisions, which are the moments that help determine who I am when the big moments come. So the cultivation of compassion is really fundamental to a compassionate life, not the turning it on and off like a switch.
One thing that what you're saying makes me wonder about is the following. When I'm attempting to cultivate that compassion, and when I'm doing it because, at least in part, because I consider myself obligated to do that as a practicing Jewish person, am I doing it because I have an obligation as a practicing Jewish person to another person? Or am I doing it because God has instructed me to cultivate this way of thinking and being and feeling, and because of my obligation towards God, I'm going to try to act a certain way and feel a certain way towards and about another person.
Would yes be an acceptable answer to that question? Because I think the answer is yes. Although one thing I will say that's interesting is that there is a fascinating argument made by Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, one of the great halachic decision makers of the 20th century, in which he basically says that in his mind, we should get to the point where in our interpersonal mitzvot, in fulfilling mitzvot ben adam l'chavero, we should not be thinking about chiyuv. We should be thinking about ahava, about love. His argument, which is complicated. I'm in the process of writing something about my hesitations about this argument, even though I also think it's very moving. His argument is that that's why we, for example, don't say a bracha, asher kishanu mitzvah tzivanu al bikur cholim. He says we don't do that because a bracha at that moment would actually instill the wrong motivation, which is I'm doing it because I have to. Whereas Judaism's own ideal is that I've gotten to the point where I'm doing it because I want to. If God forbid you're in the hospital and I can visit you, I don't go ideally because it's a mitzvah. I go because you're hurting. Now, what I would say about that is by the logic, by his logic, by Rav Weinberg's logic, even though he doesn't quite say this, is the mitzvah is cultivating myself to the point that in the moment of need, I don't need to rely on mitzvah. You understand what I mean? The mitzvah is cultivation rather than a sense of mitzvah in that moment. I'll just add, if I could, as a footnote, what makes me kind of a little hesitant about Rav Weinberg's formulation is that I think in Jewish ethics, we should be very hesitant about drawing a line between being motivated by obligation and being motivated by love. I think that in many ways in Jewish ethics, we intentionally blur those lines, right? You know, do I do it because I have to or because I want to? Yes, of course. That's exactly why I do it. Both.
Okay. So in thinking about whether I'll say the halachot of let me put it this way, relative to the body of Jewish law that's referred to as mitzvot ben adam l'chavero, the obligations one person to another, are those, do you see them as obligations that we're obliged to do because there are particular things that we have to accomplish as practicing Jews, and these are among them? Or is it more a matter of, and in some ways maybe you've answered this question already, but is it a matter of figuring out what we think we want to be obligating ourselves to do and somehow taking that on as a mirroring of what we see as the Torah as instructing us. If that question made any sense at all.
I'm not totally sure I understand that question. I understood the question. So let me try to respond and you'll tell me if I'm not getting your question right. So I think that the way that Jewish ethics thinks about this is that there are two things that exist simultaneously. Number one is a list of concrete obligations. Bikur cholim is a concrete thing I have to do, even if it can't be measured or I can never be done with it. Nichum avelim, comforting the mourner, is a concrete thing I have to do. And yet all of those things also form part of an ethos or a way of being in the world that can't be captured by a code of law, right? You know, the example that I like to give, this is intentionally sort of silly and ridiculous, but, you know, imagine that, God forbid, your friend calls you and says, you know, my spouse of 25 years just left me alone with 3 kids. I'm totally devastated. My whole life has fallen apart. And you think to yourself, well, I'm looking at the list of things that Chazal placed under walking in God's ways. You're not sick. You're not mourning in the technical sense, right? You're not dying. So there's no mitzvah here, right? That would be a sign of completely a tone-deaf misreading of the whole Jewish tradition, right? But rather, those things have helped me become the kind of person that sees another person in need and says, well, how can I be here with you? So it's both concrete actions and an ethos. The concrete actions are important because I think they're a reminder. Anytime you say that ethics involves the inner life, you run the danger of narcissism. Oh, you know what? I'm a beautiful person. I feel for people. Okay, but what do you do for them? And the concrete list helps in that way. But the ethos idea is important. Mahu rachum afata, mahu chanun afata, because lest you think, oh, Jewish ethics is just about, I showed up to the Shiva, what do you want from me? As opposed to, no, wait a second, this is a family in straits, what can I do? This is a person who's hurting, what can I do? This is a friend who's depressed, how do I not walk away, and how do I stay present, right? So I think you really have to have both kind of like a translation into concrete action and a commitment to a more fundamental ethos that involves both a way of acting and a way of responding emotionally to the world and to people within it. Did I answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
That was very helpful, very, very responsive to a question that I put in a very confusing way. But let me ask you this now. You've been talking about the development of an ethos that goes along with actions. And I think based on some of the things that you've talked about now and some other things of yours that I've heard and read, that you view the need to develop that ethos, to develop an ability to be compassionate, you view that as coming from, among other places, the idea that humans are created, but B'Tselem Elokim in the image of God. If that's correct, then when we read in the Torah about God's ability to love, okay, that's easy. But when we read in the Torah about God's jealousy, about some other, I'll say more challenging emotional aspects of the way God is described, how do we deal with those in developing an appropriate way of relating to the world?
Right. So let me try to answer this in what I hope is not too convoluted a way, but I want to answer this both kind of philosophically and then based on Chazal's own statements in rabbinic literature. So philosophically, I think we all make decisions about which character traits are ultimately more worthy of emulation than others, and by implication, about which character traits are more fundamental to God than others. To give you an example of this, I think it's very clear in Tanakh that, and I can give you, a variety of chapters and verses, that angry is something God gets, but loving is something God is. Anger is episodic with God, and love is foundational and baseline. And it is the baseline postures that we try to emulate, which are things like love, compassion, empathy. Those are all things that I include under the umbrella of love when we talk philosophically. Now, what's striking is Chazal did not hesitate, I think. The rabbis of the Talmud did not hesitate at all to make a determination about which of God's attributes they thought ought to be emulated and which not. And you even have, I think, for example, of a passage in a late Midrash Hagadol, which explicitly says you may not emulate God's anger or God's jealousy. You have no right to do that. And there's a line in Breshit Rabbah that I think is actually helpful here, which, whether or not you think this is a great reading of Tanakh, is almost immaterial, but the comment is fascinating. One of the sages says, the difference between human anger and divine anger is that God remains in control of God's self when God is angry. But human beings, anger becomes their master. And now, I'm not sure that if you read parts of Sefer Shemot, you would say, oh, God is always in control of God's anger. But for Chazal, that's very important. God never loses God's agency. But Chazal are nervous about anger, not least because they think it robs us of our ability to make a decision, right? We say things and do things that are stupid and destructive often when we're angry. And so Chazal, I think, were very nervous about anyone saying, mahu ko'es afata, which they never say, just as God is angry, so should you. Rather, they appeal to certain emotions and postures that they think are more fundamental to who God is, and that I think facilitate human growth. Another angle that we could bring into this is the 20th century Musar figure, the Yecheskel Levenstein, who basically says the Torah only gives us mitzvot that lead to virtue. There are no mitzvot that cultivate vice. Therefore, he says in this completely audacious way, going against the pshat of various psukim and ma'amarei Chazal, which he explicitly admits, there can never be a mitzvah to hate under any circumstance. Anytime you see a mitzvah to hate someone, it means hate what they're doing. Because if hate were a mitzvah, you would be instilling a vice in yourself, and that's forbidden. So that's what I would say about anger. Not that anger is always bad. There are times when anger as a way of recovering the self can be of value, but anger is dangerous enough that we don't elevate it to the status of godliness when we think about ethics. Sorry if that's long-winded, but I think it's actually both angles are important there.
Yeah, that's very helpful, I think. You've talked in your answer about the distinction between divine anger and human anger, and how that distinction leads to the conclusion that you were just talking about. Can you talk for a moment about the difference between divine love and human love, and whether that has implications for how we can try to, as humans, to emulate the divine?
Right. So here, let me just sort of underscore what's always true, which is I'm talking as one Jewish philosopher, theologian, and not for the whole tradition, which has a lot of different things to say about this. One crucial difference, it seems to me, between divine love and human love is that divine love is utterly inexhaustible. There is a moment in the book of Hosea, amazingly, where God looks at the people and says, I don't know what to do with you. You are impossible. You are inveterate idolaters. You are unfaithful. You are backsliding. And then God says, how can I give you up? How can I abandon you? I can't, because I am God and not a person. In my mind, that is one of the most arresting moments in all of Tanakh. God basically says a person could, perhaps even understandably, under certain circumstances, give up on someone they love, but not God. God's love is so unfathomably deep that God never gives up on us. God's love in that sense is unconditional. The way that I write about this in the book that I'm working on now is that God's love is unconditional, but comes with expectations. And one of the problems I think we humans have a lot is that we often confuse, in practice, if not in theory, expectations with conditions. We end up making our kids feel like, do this or I won't love you anymore. Whereas God says, I love you, I want you to do this. In other words, the spiritual life is about living up to God's love, not about earning it. God's love is always already there. Chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem. Beloved is the human being simply because she was created in the image of God, simply because that's who they are. And so that, I think, is actually really quite fundamental, and it is a difference. The interesting question in my mind is aspiring to have moments where we reflect that kind of love that God has, the kind of love that's unfathomably deep, the kind of love that's unbreakable. That's, I think, what marriage at its best can be, is a kind of tapping into that kind of energy of, I'm here. When it's good, I'm here, and when it's bad, I'm here. When we're feeling like we're madly in love with each other, I'm here. And when we're feeling like, oh my God, look who we're stuck with today, I'm here. There's a way in which covenantal faithfulness becomes really fundamental to human relationship.
I'd like to ask you, as we're kind of coming to an end of this conversation, to help us think about the following question. You've just been talking about the depth of divine love and the challenge to us as humans to try to emulate that. I'd like to ask you about the breadth of God's love, which I assume you would say extends to everyone, and ask you the following question. If we're supposed to be emulating that, there are some people who any given human being feels more capable of loving, and some people who we feel less capable of loving. How broad should our love be towards humanity and the individuals who make it up? And in thinking about emulating divine love, how do we deal with the fact that it's going to be really hard for me as a human being to try to extend my love really broadly?
Yeah, I mean, so, Judd, it's amazing. Every question you've asked is really, really hard, and we could probably spend 2 hours on each one. This one, I think what I would begin by saying is that we probably ought to, in our next conversation, talk a little bit about what we do and don't mean by loving, right? Because obviously I'm not going to love my neighbor in the same way that I love my wife or my children, right? Love, one of the things that I talk about in my writing a bit, and still trying to develop this, is the relationship between what we mean when we talk about love in ethics and what we mean when we talk about caring about people. If you tell me that I have to love a mass murderer in the sense of feel enormous oceans of positive feelings towards them, I might find it hard or even impossible. But if you tell me I have to wish for the best for them, including wishing that they heal, I'm open to that. In other words, I think the next discussion, the discussion that our whole discussion invites, is what do we mean by love? And I'm trying to use in my own kind of philosophical and more importantly, my own pastoral and my teaching and my traveling around and talking about Torah, trying to use love as a kind of umbrella term for what psychologists call pro-social emotions, right? For the whole series of positive, affective responses to others. And I think there are forms of love which we ought to have for people who we don't like. I think that in the way that I'm using it, you can love someone you don't like. I think you probably have a mitzvah to love people you don't like. Not, again, in the sense that like Judd goes home and says, I love my spouse. I love that guy across the street who just tried to kill me, right? But in the sense of, it's a famous story of Uri and Hillel. Don't pray for them to die. Pray for their hearts to change. Pray for them to be different. To try to kind of close your eyes and daven or pray in a real way for someone who you don't like is a profoundly heart-opening experience. It's actually very powerful. And it also requires you to, this is the paradox that maybe we can end with, to have compassion with yourself for the ways in which you find it incredibly hard. It's very hard work. Most of us do not just go, think about a person who really crushingly hurt us last week, focus on davening and pray for their well-being. That's really hard, right? And you have to be compassionate with yourself. We all carry around wounds and injuries and things that get in the way. And yet the aspiration to want people to do okay. I have an old friend who used to say, and when I was younger, it drove me crazy. Whenever someone would hurt her, she would tell me about it, and then she would say, bless his heart. And I didn't like it. I thought, why is this so cheesy? And then as I've gotten older, I've actually thought like she was saying something really profound, like, may God heal him. Right? That's what Bruria tells Hillel in the Gemara and Brachot. Don't pray for your enemies to die. Pray for them to change. That's a form of love. Okay. That's wanting the best for them.
Profound indeed, very helpful. Thank you. Thank you very much for your thoughts. Okay.
Good to talk to you as always, Judd.